So good morning and welcome to the second podcast. I'm Linda O'Sullivan and I'm delighted to be here this morning with Dr. Andy Mayers, who is a psychologist at Bournemouth University, who actually specialises in perinatal mental health, including fathers. But more excitingly for me, he is also one of our patrons for Dorset Mind. So welcome, Andy, and thank you for giving us your time this morning.
Oh, you're very welcome, Linda.
Really
good morning.
To see you. Really good to see you. Now, we're talking today about International Father's Mental Health Day. And Andy, I'm slightly embarrassed to say that until I came to Dorset Mind, I was very aware of Father's Day, but I wasn't actually aware of this international day. Can you tell us what it's about?
Yeah, it's been running now for 7-8 years, perhaps. Created by a good friend of mine, Mark Williams in Wales, and Dan Singley in the USA, and it was to essentially mark and celebrate everything about fathers and their mental health.
I've got to be honest, Andy, that as a mother of three, I've read some of the work that you've been involved in this field, but actually I'm slightly embarrassed to share here this morning that I don't think I even considered the impact when I delivered my children on their father. Why is this so important? What do fathers need when they, first of all, learn they're becoming a parent, but then actually then when they're being part of the journey of the birth and then into fatherhood?
I think that's a very good point, and I think one of the things we can remember is that fatherhood today is very different to what it was even 20 years ago, and certainly as a person in his 60s, but you know, when I came along, it had been very different for my father completely. But fathers are very much involved in the entire process now, through pregnancy planning, the pregnancy itself, the birth and postnatal support, and being there. They are every part of that. But I think what we're finding is that society, and to some extent health professionals, are still playing catch-up. It's getting a lot better because of campaigns like this, but it's still playing catch-up with really the father. And I should really sort of reinforce the fact that yes, we're talking mental health here and about what kind of support we can get for them and why we need to do this. But none of that is ever taking it away from the mother. This is in sort of additional to make sure the entire family is looked after.
I know that myself, I had I'm quite sure with my first child, I experienced what is defined as postnatal depression. And I don't think I gave one thought to how their father was feeling at the time. Can you describe then what would help? What's needed for men when that's an experience in the family at that point, when it should be a joyous time in theory?
One of the things that happens as well is that without the information and support, fathers will often question, well, why on earth is my wife feeling this way? She should be really happy. So we need to give more education about what mums can go through at this stage, what it is that could be potentially causing this, what those experiences are, and what we can do to try and help resolve those problems, but also to give fathers those toolkits, be able to give that support, almost to give them permission to be able to feel the way they are. Typically, a man's role, it might seem, is to try and fix it. He might say, well, my wife is sad, so I'll buy her a new car, or take her on holiday, or I'll cook dinner tonight, that kind of thing. Well, actually, the practical things are a good thing, but but to try and understand what she's actually going through, and the way in which you can support her, perhaps by being that shoulder to cry on, about being that partner to go along to the GP to talk about it, just being there generally for the support. Up until that point, fathers were getting absolutely no support for that at all, and we wanted to make sure that they were getting that information and that support and those resources.
It's really important, isn't it? Because you talk about the fact that inevitably, I think back to what my father, and things have changed for fathers, and there is more involvement. Fathers are encouraged, but again, it'll be a really anxious time for men, and if their partner is experiencing anxiety, depression, and in my case, it was my world was upside down, and it should have been joyous, and I was trying to come to terms with that. What support is there for men?
We can certainly talk about what is around now, but I think it's worth talking about what wasn't around before, because we were seeing repeatedly fathers telling us there was absolutely nothing, nowhere for them to go, nowhere where they could go and find out what was happening, what they could do, what the consequences was likely to be, what the impact could be on them. None of that was there at all. So we set about taking what had already been anecdotally known, and I, alongside many others across the country, started doing some formal research to actually find out what was going on. And then we used that research to influence NHS England to make those changes. And we can talk about those changes later on. But it is also worth mentioning the fact that the impact it also has on the father too, because it can then have a burden on his own mental health, and he needs some help with that too. So we need to make sure there was out there. As a result of our research and the campaigning and all the other stuff we've been doing, we do now have, certainly within elements of the NHS, where fathers are now being screened for their mental health, which had never happened before. So that's a good start. And in various areas
Is that quite common? Is that happening in Dorset?
It is happening in Dorset. I can't speak for the entire country, and I've been working with some neighbouring counties, including Hampshire, but in Dorset, we have a perinatal mental health services, a mother and baby unit, and there is a community mental health team that deals directly with those mothers. And where it becomes clear that the father is affected too, there is now resources for those fathers. So fathers can be signposted by health professionals to that support, to try and help with their own mental health and for supporting their partner.
What would you say the issues are for men? Is it a cultural, societal issue around, stiff upper lip, having to be the stronger, masculine partner that has to hold everything together? How do men get that support? How is it being received?
I think one of the biggest challenges we had was almost giving men, fathers, the permission to actually ask for that help, because the society image was about, man up, be the strong one, you're the rock. The last thing your wife needs right now is you falling apart, so just pull it all together, park your emotions. And of course that is actually dangerous. One of the reasons we know that male suicide is higher than it is for women is because they park their emotions, because they won't talk about it, because they won't go and seek that help. So we wanted to make sure that we were actually doing that, to make sure they did come out and talk about these things and get the support that they need.
And can I just ask you, you mentioned earlier the work that you've influenced in terms of NHS and policy. What is that about, and what else is there still yet to be done there?
That's a very good question, because although we very much celebrated, it was getting on for 3 years ago now, that NHS England announced that they were going to screen fathers for their mental health, which is what we wanted, and that was a great thing. One of the problems we had was that in the early part of 2020, when some of these resources would then begin to get rolled out, we then had COVID, so everything went back a bit. But even without that, whilst there's a lot to celebrate about fathers being screened for their mental health, we have to recognise there's still a lot more to do, because what they're actually doing is screening fathers for their mental health when the mother is being referred to perinatal mental health services. And not all mothers are referred to perinatal mental health services, and those who are, not every single one of those mothers will be sort of taken into that service. So those fathers are not going to get picked up in any case. And we also know that fathers might develop mental health problems themselves, which means they're not going to get picked up. And another thing we haven't spoken about and can do is those fathers who are in the birthing room, as they often are these days, apart from during COVID, most fathers are in, if not practically all fathers are in the birthing room these days. That's absolutely fine. It's all part of the process. But when it goes horribly wrong, when he's in that room and there are problems that could be a potential threat to the well-being and even life of his wife and or baby, and he's witnessing this, he's getting absolutely nothing. So for all those reasons, we're still getting absolutely nowhere near enough support for fathers, and that's why we still needed to have these days to raise that awareness.
It's really important. And again, you know, just listening to you there, Andy, I can think about my own experiences. My first child was exactly as you described. It was the labour got complicated, and my children's father was with me for most of that process, but then he was just shoved out of the room. I don't think I even considered his mental health. What can be done to support men at that point?
If we're talking about maybe, say birth trauma, then I think we need to recognise the impact it's going to have. When we first started doing work with fathers and them witnessing birth traumas, some groups immediately said, well, how dare you take the focus away from the mothers? After all, what they're going through, they're the ones who are going through the pain. They're the ones who are having to be stitched up. They're the ones who are having to have emergency C-sections. What's it got to do with the fathers? It's about making sure that the fathers are supported because, first of all, they've got absolutely no idea what's going on. They've been shoved out of the room with no information about what's just happened and not understanding what the consequences might be physically and emotionally for his partner, or what he can do to make sure that she remains well. And maybe the baby's been taken into a neonatal unit. So this is all really scary stuff. And he's witnessed a trauma. And it's exactly the same as any other witnessed traumatic incident. The impact on him could potentially develop to PTSD. And if we're not vigilant towards that, then the consequences for that father can be devastating, both in terms of his own health and mental health, but also his relationship with his wife, partner and the child.
Okay. Again, reflecting on my own experience, my children's father went straight back to work.
Yeah.
And we did have a traumatic experience, and it was also joyful, but it was also traumatic. Are there other things besides relying upon, for example, the medical profession, the GP? Is there other things that employers could be doing? Fathers returning to work?
This is one of the things I really am beginning to work on now, because all parents return to work, but the fathers often return sooner, and they may still be recovering from what they've seen. Their baby might still be in a neonatal unit. And one thing we do know about the emotional and psychological impact of trauma, for instance, is that it can kick in several weeks, maybe even months after an event, and by which time they're at work. They're not going to get picked up by the GP or the health visitor or anyone else like that. So we need to find ways of doing that, and the employer is one of them. Nationally, I'm working with an organisation called Peppy Health, and what we're doing with Peppy is actually going into the workplace and giving them the toolkits to be able to support parents and fathers postnatally, and then being able to signpost them onto other services. So that's the kind of thing we are beginning to do in the workforce.
You and I both know that never before has there been such a sort of spotlight on the conversation around mental health in general, and challenging the stigma and encouraging people to talk. What are the issues that you think we are facing?
I think one of the things that was difficult, certainly during COVID, was that it was impossible for fathers to be in the birthing room. They couldn't go to midwifery appointments. Many of the other services were online. We're kind of catching up from that. But post-COVID, I think like any other areas of mental health, we're now in a very different position financially. So a lot of the funding that was going into some of these things had to be diverted elsewhere, and we've got other challenges. Many of the national and local charities really struggled as a result of COVID, and I'm absolutely delighted that Dorset Mind weathered that storm because of some of the sort of processes that were in place. But the challenges, I think, going forward is to be able to need to back up what we're saying. So it's all very well having campaigns like this and having International Fathers Mental Health Day, like we had World Mental Health Day and we have Mental Health Awareness Week. they're only so good as actually making change happen. Because if we only talk about it on one day, then we're not doing anything for the rest of the year. And we need to make sure that what we are doing is going forward into real resources. So it's no good giving fathers almost the encouragement to come forward and seek help, when at the end of the day that will be against everything that they feel inside, for them to then suddenly be faced with a brick wall because there's no support out there. So we need to back that up with resources and support that is going to work for them too.
Okay. Do you think that therefore organisations like ourselves, Dorset Mind, need to be doing more approaches to support men?
Local charity that I work with, I'm one of the trustees, Dorset. We actually are providing support for fathers, and it can be self-referred, so that need not go through a GP, it need not go through a health visitor or any other health professionals, because often the stigma is about, opening up and not being seen as a man. But like anybody else, often the perception is if you go to the GP, they're going to give you drugs. And some men, they'd rather have the toolkits to be able to get better rather than to have to rely on drugs. So we need to have more community support, more charity support. And we are beginning to do that through Dorset, which is great. I think one of the other things we need to recognise, and we're still working on how this will pan out, is the way in which we encourage men to seek that help and the way in which we give them that help is going to be very different. We know this is going to be very different to what it might be for women. If you try to badge an event for a man about mental health, they're not likely to go. If you build into an event that's about something that they like doing, and you make it almost sport related to be, to use a stereotype, it need not be that, but build in a mental health element into that, they're more likely to go, and then they're more likely to open up.
We need to keep the conversation going. And I wonder, it's evident that you've got a wealth of research and knowledge in your professional right, but would you mind if I just asked you, in terms of all your, the theory, for you, what in your experience can you reflect upon that really were either a moment where you found yourself affected and had nowhere to turn to, or the alternative, you had support? What were the moments for you as a father?
That's really interesting, and I think just to put the whole thing in context, we've been working with fathers' mental health for 7-8 years now, but I've been working with mothers' mental health for 20 years. And even when I started it then, I recognised very quickly how incredibly important it was to get this right, because it wasn't just getting it right, and in that case for the mother, but it was also getting it right for the family, for the child, for the impact that it could have for the child developing. There were so many things that made it really important, and that motivated me. And then I recognised that fathers needed support too, and I could see all the academic and research reasons and all the men that I'd met. So that made it very important. But then as my own children started growing up, becoming parents themselves, then I saw what I'd learnt professionally and academically come true in front of me, and seeing all the things that they went through, particularly with my daughters, as they started having children, the anxiety and struggles that they had going through pregnancy, and the support that they were getting from their husbands, their partners, and what they were going through. All three of them, to some extent, had less than ideal births. As one or two of them were very difficult indeed. So seeing what they were going through on that, and also what their partners were going through, and how they were then identifying what kind of support they needed, it became very, very real. And it actually motivated me even more, looking at my grandchildren, and recognise one of the things we know is that, talking about any perinatal mental health problem, the potential impact on that child can be devastating. We don't say that to scare people or make them feel guilty. It just reinforces the fact that we need to do more to support the parents at that time. And one of the things that can happen with any parent when they have a mental health problem at this time is that the bonding and contact that they might normally have with that infant can be compromised. And one of the things I saw immediately, I've been blessed with the fact that I've probably been there or thereabouts on the very day that at least 6 of my grandchildren have been born. I've held them. One of the things that those babies do immediately is look into your eyes. And that eye contact is so overwhelmingly sort of a whole different experience. And only when you've had a newborn baby stare into your eyes, you know that. It was then almost like all the lights went on. I thought, this is why I do it.
But what about partners the father is in same-sex relationship, and or, for example, fathers who have adopted children? What's the sort of support out there for all communities?
Still minimal. We need to talk about all partners, regardless of any binary issues, regardless of whether they are biological father, adoptive father, transsexual partners. It doesn't matter. They're all parents. Absolutely. And there's some wonderful groups out there like LGBT Mummies, the Queer Birth Club. There's some wonderful groups out there. I've just recently done some work with one of my own students looking at lesbian partners and their experience of birth trauma, but particularly what the non-gestational birth partner was going through when she saw the gestational partner, her wife, go through, and the support and they were getting and recognition. I mean, every single parent matters. Every parent needs support to be able to be an entire family and bring up that child in a way that is a safe and secure environment and a loving, blossoming relationship. And we need to make sure that those partners are getting that support to do that.
I think what you're touching on there is really interesting, isn't it? Because it's about how this is a sort of cultural shift, isn't it? About how people are supported in their own right. And I think the work you've been doing at an international level, it's really vital in terms of ensuring that it isn't just about a policy shift. There is much more about a cultural agenda here, isn't there, for understanding all parents' mental health, but men's mental health in the context of father's mental health as well, isn't there?
I think so. And I think, I mean, what we got to remember, as you know, we're saying this with our own cultural biases of sort of white, middle class, Western European, and it can be very different elsewhere too. And in our culture, then it has been very difficult over the years for men to be recognised, that they can have mental health problems, that they can talk about these things and all the macho things that go with that. But I think we've got an awful lot to learn from other cultures about the way in which children are brought up. I think some cultures have got a much better way of bringing a new child into the world where everyone is involved, and we should be having that here too.
From your personal experience, what was it in terms of your own memories of when your partner gave birth and you became a father for the first time? What was it that enabled your mental health to stay balanced?
Now, there's an interesting thing, because we were talking earlier about traditional fathers and all of that sort of thing. None of those daughters are my biological daughters. The youngest was 4 or 5 when I met my now wife. We'd been in previous relationships. My first wife had died. Sue was divorced. She had the 3 daughters, 5, 7 and 8, I think they were at the time. And now they're 30 years on. They're a lot older than that. But they're as good as having been my own daughters, and they see me as a father too. And I'm every bit as bought into what they've been through in terms of, having their babies, and their children, the grandchildren see me as granddad. They don't know either way. So I wasn't there it wasn't part of that. But one thing I do remember is I got younger siblings, and I remember distinctly, I would have been about 6 when my brother was born, and I was walking on the beach at Highcliffe with my father, pacing, waiting for that lad to arrive. And, you know, so it's so different. He wasn't there, and I thought nothing of it, you know. So I think times have changed.
Really changed. And I am really interesting talking to you this morning, Andy. But I wonder, yes, times have changed, but you said earlier there's still more to be done. Is there anything that you would say to anyone that's listening to this, any father-to-be, any father, any man who's needing support around mental health? What would you encourage them to do?
I mean, initially talk to your partner, talk to your mates, talk to your parents. But above all else, you know, if you really think that things are beginning to struggle, or indeed you believe that your partner is beginning to struggle, the first step is often the GP. I know we said earlier that there is some reluctance, but at the end of the day, if it's about keeping you safe, then you should be reaching out. If you can't talk to the GP, then look for the resource. There are many fathers' mental health groups growing across the country. You can certainly go to my website. Locally, wherever possible, we would refer them, if suitable, into DORPIP. But nationally, there's many groups that I work with across the country who at the very least, would be able to talk to Dad about what support they can get and where they can go next.
Okay, it's really been interesting talking to you, Andy. And again, I think what you've shared today, I'm sure there are many people listening who will hopefully reach out if they need to. But I think one of the things that I've gained from our conversation is that the importance of celebrating Father's Day and actually maybe the message is for fathers to really make sure they start looking after themselves and reach out and talk about their mental health.
Yeah, no, absolutely agree. And that reminds me, my father, I mean, he's 92 now, and it's Father's Day for him too.
Yeah. Andy, thank you so much.
Thank you.